14. The leader as emotional architect. Leadership in global organizations has always been described in terms of clarity, vision, decisiveness, and competence. These qualities matter, of course. But in environments where tone travels unpredictably, urgency fractures across borders, silence shifts meaning, and organizational memory weighs heavily on interpretation, another kind of leadership becomes essential, a kind of leadership rarely named, yet profoundly felt. The leader becomes not simply a communicator, but an emotional architect. An emotional architect does not focus solely on what is said. They focus on what is received. They understand that their voice, as it travels through countries, cultures, and emotional histories, becomes more than sound. It becomes structure. It shapes psychological safety. It frames urgency. It steadies or destabilizes tone. It signals coherence or confusion. Every message they give is more than content, it is a piece of emotional infrastructure that others must rely on. Many leaders find this realization both humbling and liberating. It shifts the focus from trying to control outcomes to shaping conditions, from demanding alignment to creating alignment. One executive once told me that learning this changed her leadership more than any training she had ever received. "I always thought leadership was about giving direction," she said. "Now I realize leadership is about shaping the emotional climate in which direction becomes possible." She had discovered something true in every global organization: alignment is not enforced, alignment is engineered. And leaders engineer alignment through emotional architecture, through the consistency, stability, empathy, self-awareness, and presence they bring into every interaction. An emotional architect recognizes first that leadership cannot be one emotional state. It must be one emotional pattern. Teams do not require leaders who are always calm or always energetic or always warm. They require leaders who are emotionally legible, whose patterns of tone, urgency, and signals remain recognizable across contexts. Legibility gives teams the confidence to interpret without guessing. It creates an internal rhythm they can trust. One leader I coached realized this after reviewing recordings of her own meetings across multiple regions. She was shocked to discover that what felt internally like minor fluctuations in tone appeared externally as significant emotional shifts. "I didn't hear it until I watched myself through their ears," she said. That experience transformed her approach. She did not become robotic. She became mindful. She began to narrate context more clearly, articulate her emotional state when necessary, and pace her communication in a way that felt steady rather than variable. Emotional architecture is not about suppressing emotion. It is about contextualizing it, giving teams the cues they need to understand its meaning. Another aspect of emotional architecture involves how leaders hold space during ambiguity. When situations are fluid, global teams rely on leadership not to deliver perfect information, but to stabilize the emotional climate. In these moments, leaders often underestimate the power of their presence. Silence, when held intentionally, becomes security rather than uncertainty. A steady voice becomes structure. A thoughtful pause becomes permission to think rather than pressure to act. Ambiguity becomes shared rather than isolating. One global chief of operations discovered this during a prolonged supply crisis. Initially, he believed he needed to offer constant answers. But as the situation unfolded, he realized his team was not actually seeking solutions from him, they were seeking emotional stability. "They didn't need me to know everything," he said. "They needed me to be grounded." Once he shifted from solution giving to emotional anchoring, the organization became calmer and more aligned. His presence itself became a structural element, predictable, steady, reliable. Emotional architects also recognize that global teams interpret leadership behavior differently based on hierarchy expectations. In highly hierarchical cultures, a leader's tone carries immense weight. In more egalitarian cultures, tone is interpreted more conversationally. Effective leaders do not erase these differences, they adapt with awareness. They adjust not what they say, but how they land. One executive developed a habit of pre-framing his tone. Before delivering a firm message, he would say, "I'm going to speak more directly here so we're all clear, but this is not a sign of pressure." In cultures sensitive to hierarchy, this simple framing prevented misinterpretation. In cultures comfortable with directness, it simply clarified intention. Emotional architecture is constructed from small, intentional signals like this, signals that acknowledge how meaning travels. Another leader, working across 6 continents, began ending her global calls with the question, "What did you hear me say?" Not in a corrective way, but in an exploratory one. The answers revealed subtle emotional interpretations she would never have seen otherwise. Over time, this practice helped her recalibrate her presence and build deeper alignment. Emotional architecture grows from curiosity, especially about how others experience the leader. But perhaps the most important skill of an emotional architect is attunement. Attunement is the ability to notice emotional shifts that most leaders overlook: a hesitation before responding, a change in someone's tempo of speech, a sudden formality in a message, an unusual silence from a normally expressive region. These details are not trivial. They are the early signals of drift. They are the emotional data that precede behavioral data. Attuned leaders act before drift becomes divergence. A senior leader shared how she learned this when a usually confident regional director began writing unusually short emails. Nothing was technically wrong, she said. But his rhythm had changed. When she reached out informally, she discovered that the region was experiencing internal confusion about a recent instruction, confusion that could have escalated into full drift if left unaddressed. Because she noticed the emotional shift early, the misalignment was corrected before it became a global issue. Emotional architects see these microshifts not as noise, but as information. They treat the emotional life of the organization with the same attention others give to financial indicators or operational metrics. Finally, emotional architecture requires humility. Global leaders cannot fully control how they are interpreted, but they can deeply influence it. They cannot eliminate cultural differences, but they can stabilize the emotional environment in which those differences operate. They cannot force alignment, but they can design conditions where alignment thrives. Humility in this context means recognizing that leadership does not travel as the leader intends. It travels as others receive it. And effective leaders do not resist this truth, they embrace it. They become curious. They adapt. They refine. They recalibrate. They view leadership not as a broadcast, but as a shared emotional space they are responsible for shaping. The emotional architect does not lead through control. They lead through coherence. In the next chapter, we explore how leaders maintain this emotional stability not once, not occasionally, but consistently, how they resist the pressures, habits, and fluctuations that can so easily destabilize the emotional climate of a global organization.